Welcome. It's just gone 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Wednesday, the 6th of September, and you are watching episode 104 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, Energy Transition or Treachery, is Graham Young. Graham is the Executive Director of the Australian Institute for Progress, a classic liberal Australian think tank based in Brisbane. He has an interest in a number of policy areas, including housing, energy, climate change, and individuals' rights. Along with a number of academics, scientists, and public thinkers concerned about the erosion of scientific standards and public governance during the COVID pandemic, he founded Australians for Science and Freedom. He has been interested in science and policy implications of climate change since the late 1970s. He is a contributor to the Australian Financial Review, Epoch Times, The Spectator, and the Courier Mail, as well as appearing weekly on the ABC Brisbane Drive Time in panel discussion on state politics. Welcome, Graham.
Great to be here, Bill. I've got a special soft spot for North Queensland. My mum was born in Townsville in 1922 and lived the first years of her life till she went down to Melbourne during the war in Cairns. I think there was about 3,000 people in Cairns at that stage.
I think the population would have pumped up during World War II.
No, I think people were wanting to get south during World War II.
Military-wise, I think.
Yeah, no, I don't think they were sticking around, but Mum was a millet, and there's lots of millets, well, there used to be anyway, around the tablelands. You know, they tended to be farmers. They came over, they were Cornish tin miners originally. And an interesting fact is that my two uncles were the only men killed from Cairns during World War II.
Oh, that's
you can see in the Uniting Church on is it McLeod Street? Anyway, there's the Uniting Church up there, and there's 3 stained glass windows, and one's for one uncle and one's for the other, and one's got King Arthur on it. So one was, I think, Lancelot, and the other's Galahad.
Oh, well, there you go. Interesting. So you were basically raised in Melbourne, were you? Or
No. Mum went down to Melbourne during the war. She was a Methodist deaconess, so the Methodist Church sort of enlisted women to help in the mission to outback Australia originally. Mum was in the second intake, and she was the first deaconess that they decided to put into parish work rather than sending her out into the outback. So she worked in Melbourne, and then she went down to Tasmania, and then she came up to Brisbane in the 1950s, and she worked with a minister called Arthur Preston up here, and Arthur Preston was a bit of a star in his day. They had thousands of people would come to services at the West End Methodist Mission, and he set up the Blue Nurses, which is now Blue Care, in Brisbane, and so Mum was his deaconess. She met Dad, who was an Anglican at the time, but he'd inherited some money and he donated some of it to the Blue Nurses. And I'm not sure how large the donation was, but it was significant enough that everyone said, wow, we've got to get this guy together with our deaconess.
So your mother married him.
And they got married, yeah.
Okay, interesting family history there.
Dad was born in Brisbane in 1912.
Oh, we won't hold that against him because at that time, even Brisbane was a regional town, a backwater compared to Sydney and Melbourne.
Well, Mum, in her later years, she'd say, you Southerners. She wasn't talking about people in Sydney and Melbourne. She was talking about us here in Brisbane.
Well, there you go. Can you tell us a little bit about the Australian Institute of Progress and its foundations and its works and its involvement in what sort of topics?
Yeah, look, we're a classical liberal think tank, and what that means is we favour policies that allow people to make decisions for themselves, essentially. So if you don't own your own property, you can't make a decision for yourself. If you're not allowed free speech, you can't make a decision for yourself. If you're not allowed free association, you can't get together with people so you can make decisions for yourselves. We're not anti-government. Someone has to make the rules and someone has to keep them. You don't get freedoms without there being some restrictions. And we think that, people do sometimes fall off the edge and they need to be looked after, but we think of welfare as being a trampoline, not a safety net.
Yeah, so I think the trouble is now we've got to a situation where the government has so many programs where the average person benefits from it, either through childcare or other allowances and that. And now we're talking about, I think there's going to be another injection of billions of dollars in the system to prop up people, with an extra $50 here and $50 there. It just it's basically a creep of socialism where people become dependent on a largesse, some part of the largesse for their daily livelihoods. And I think this is the sneaky undercurrent of big government.
Yeah, look, I wouldn't have a problem with socialism if it actually worked. There's a news item I saw just late this afternoon that almost half of Germans think that it's probably not worth working because of the social security benefits that are available to them. We have people who tout a thing called the
living wage.
Basic. Basic income.
I think it's called living wage or something. That's right.
Universal basic income. Well, no. Well, living wages, that's a different concept. We've had that in Australia since the Harvester case back in the early 1900s. And you can argue about whether it was a good idea or not. But the universal basic income is the idea that before you get up in the morning, you should basically have a government payment. Think of it almost as a retainer. And then you determine whether you'll work or whether you'll rely on that. I've been in arguments with people, some of them who I thought were on my side of the fence, and they've said, oh, no, this would be great. It means people would have more time to look after elderly relatives or people who are sick, and it would mean that more people would set up small businesses. Now, I think all of that's wrong. And I think that Germany might be suggesting that to us because the welfare payments you're talking about there are similar to what we're talking about with a universal basic income. Although my example has always been that one of the problems with Aboriginal remote communities is that we pay them what we call sit-down money. And it doesn't work. It produces dysfunctional communities, and we can see the damage that that's doing. So that's one form of socialism. The idea that big uncle's there, big nana's there to look after you, and you don't have to look after yourself. And of course, that way of looking at things also deprives you of agency. It stops you thinking about what's best for yourself, and it stops you thinking about what's best for the people that are closest and dearest to you. And it stops you doing something to improve your situation because you're too comfortable. And that is a huge danger in this modern world that we live in, where we are so wealthy that you could have been an emperor in ancient Rome and you wouldn't have the standard of living that you or I have. You wouldn't be able to hop on a jet and travel to Europe, as I'm going to do later this year, for a couple of weeks holiday. It just wasn't possible.
I think the other problem with that is it's hard enough for people to get motivated as it is. So we've already got a lot of people in some areas that sort of are coasting and have intergenerational welfare. If the temptation or the money is there's always a temptation, well, I'll just take the easy way out. And we miss out on so much productivity. If we don't have productivity in the nation, well, then we won't get that money to pay people. I mean, No, money doesn't invent itself. I mean, it's got to be created through work and enterprise. You can't have
it's
a
wealth.
few people doing it.
It's wealth that you want to create, not money. Money is a measure of wealth, and money can be debased through inflation and various other means. But it's wealth that you want to create, and wealth has to be tended. There's a saying, rags to rags in 3 generations, that the first generation makes it, the second generation consolidates it, and the third generation wastes it. And I think we're at risk of that in Australia, that we've built a sophisticated and wealthy society, but we've lost touch with how that society was built, and therefore we don't understand how to maintain it. So you hear the federal government saying, we're going to increase wages and that'll increase productivity. No, what increases productivity is producing more for the same or fewer inputs. And that will allow you to increase wages, but the wage increase follows after productivity. It doesn't precede it.
Well, the thing is, if you don't have that productivity increase, all you get is inflation, and the wages you get soon dissipate in the cost of overall goods because of the rise in CPI. These sort of periodic wage reviews or without productivity is just a prod for inflation, and you don't really get anywhere. You still can only buy 4 loaves of bread anyway with your money, even if you've got a pay rise, because in a few months the price of bread will go up.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I think you and I are both old enough to remember the 70s. And that's exactly what we got back then. And, inflation peaked at, I think it might have been 13%. And I can remember borrowing for my first house, and we went to the bank and we got a loan at 17.5%. And I can remember in our business, our borrowings topped off at 21.5%. And that was, they talk about wage push inflation. Everyone would expect that prices would go up. So people would put their wage pitch in at that figure, and businesses would have to accept it, and they put their prices up at that figure, and it just keep chasing itself. And at the same time, in that period, our productivity didn't exactly go backwards, but it wasn't increasing. So we had what they called stagflation. And I think there's a big risk that we're going to go into a stagflationary period now if we continue with the same federal government. And I can't see there being any chance of them changing their minds. So it has to be a case of us changing the government.
I think the thing is too, we've had so many examples in their history. You have to talk about Argentina or Colombia, or even if you go back to post World War I Germany and the inflation rate. We've seen there's enough lessons around. It beggars belief that we would go on the same. Any government would pick the same trajectory again.
Oh, well, I don't think it does beg a belief, Bill, because we've stopped teaching kids about history. So you're looking at a generation coming to power who haven't actually been exposed to those realities. And to the extent they have been exposed to those realities, have been given alternative theories. So one of the big lies of probably the last 10 years has been a thing called modern monetary theory. And what that basically says is that governments can borrow as much as they like because they print their own, as long as they do it in their own currency, because they print their own currency. And that with inflation, with borrowing rates down around, well, what do we get, 2.14%, they can afford to borrow to do anything because the cost of repaying it is minimal. Now, anyone who's got any sort of passing knowledge of economic history knows that that's wrong. But serious academics and serious politicians bought into it. And, part of what we're seeing as a result of that is that state debt, and to a lesser extent federal debt, has exploded. I think Victoria is going to hit something like 150 billion within the next 10 years. New South Wales debt's got out of control, even though they privatised, was it 20 billion worth of assets? Something like that. And Queensland's debt is now out of control, even though we're getting an extra $5 billion out of coal royalties by stealing from the shareholders in coal companies, because they're making what the Treasurer alleges are super profits. But that expenditure has been fueled by the idea that governments can just keep borrowing. And that's a really bad idea.
Well, the biggest risk for us is the fact that we're such a big importer of goods. One of the things that tends to happen is the value of your currency gradually dissipates, and you start paying more for stuff being shipped in. It's all right if you're a big internal economy, but we aren't. We are not a big internal economy.
It doesn't even work if you're a big internal economy, because what happens when you just borrow to do anything is that you do anything, whether there's a decent economic return there or not. So that means, the better the economic return, at the end of the day, the better the productivity and the more wealth. And if you're doing it and you're not creating wealth and you're pushing more money in, even in a closed economy, you're creating inflation. What you're talking about is the currency effect that then follows when your currency is debasing itself all the time, because overseas investors, and we're dependent on overseas investors to fund our debt markets and also to a large extent our capital markets, they say, well, our currency isn't devaluing, but theirs is. So to invest there, we need to take into account that in X amount of time, their currency isn't going to be worth what it is. So that then pushes the exchange rate down, and that then makes imports more expensive. One good side effect, though, is that it makes exports cheaper for people overseas. So it's, in some senses, it's good for export industries, but it's not so good for the consumer. Your electronic goods are going to be more expensive. Your cars are going to be more expensive. Your clothes are going to be more expensive. Your movies are going to be more expensive.
One thing the government has seemed to lost vision of is actually wealth creation. When we have multi-billion-dollar projects, they're usually on something that actually is, in the long term, just a liability. If you look at the Cross River Rail, I think it started at 5 billion. I reckon it's going to blow out to 12 billion by the time it's finished. But that $12 billion, all right, you've got a railway line under the Brisbane River and it saves people 8 minutes travel time or something like that. But it's a tunnel that's a liability forever, like it's high maintenance. They're not cheap to maintain. And the other thing is, the people paying fares on those trains, their fares are still going to be subsidised by some level. It won't be that their fares is going to be adding money back into the coffers that much.
Yeah, so you're right. Every extra passenger on the Brisbane Metropolitan Rail network is an extra loss to state revenue. So if they are successful in getting more passengers on the system, they're just going to lose more money. And when you look at Brisbane's rail system, it's a spoke and wheel system, which means that all the rail lines go into the CBD and then they go out again. So they're designed to service the CBD employment hub, if you want to think of the CBD that way. But the fact is that more and more jobs are being created outside the CBD as a percentage of total employment. So while there might be more people being employed in the CBD, it's a smaller and smaller percentage of the overall employment. And on top of that, you've now got this work from home phenomenon where there has been a definite decrease in the number of people or the number of person hours being worked in the CBD, which means a lot of businesses need less office space, but also means they need less public transport. So it was a really bad call when they made it. It's never been justified on a cost-benefit analysis. And they do feasibilities where even when, they do a feasibility later than the first one and the passenger patronage hasn't gone up as was predicted, they still start at that lower figure, but they then have an even steeper curve at the end so that by the payoff date, they're up to the number of passengers they need. It's just a pure fabrication, and someone ought to have been sacked for it a long time ago. I think the main reason that railway is going through, and I'm a big beneficiary of it because my office is at Wollongabba. So I'm going to be able to walk up to a train station and go anywhere very easily. But it was Jackie Trad's big idea, and what Jackie wanted, Jackie got. And what Jackie got, we're all going to have to pay for.
And the other thing is, well, we needed extra trains, and they're suddenly cost us an extra couple of $1 billion as well.
Well, it's worse than that. So yes, so they've onshored the manufacture of trains, and you might think that's a good idea. I'm not sure that it is if we can't produce them for what are they, about 50% more expensive, and that's on the figures we've got at the moment than getting them overseas. But we're also going to have to do a whole lot of work to the track, which isn't caught up in the costings you're aware of. And you may be wondering why I'm so across this. We did a paper the last election. We got some experts on transport to have a look at this. And so some of the issues you've got are that the signalling system needs to be upgraded. And get this, if they did the upgrading the signalling system without the tunnels, they could get the same frequency of trains. So they don't actually need the tunnels to carry the extra number of people. Second problem, though, is if you get the extra frequency of trains, there's a whole lot of level crossings down here you've got to eliminate. Because at the moment, the trains go every 15 minutes, I think, in peak hour, and every half hour outside. Well, there's a lot of streets, a lot of arterial roads that would come to a halt if the train was going every 7.5 minutes. You'd never get through that intersection. So you've got to have a level crossing. You've got to eliminate a level crossing. There's also areas where to get the frequency of trains, you've got to widen. No one's costed any of this in. No one's costed any of this in. So it's a really big black hole that won't deliver extra train services for, I suspect, another 20 or 30 years. So the benefits that they're touting won't even be there, Bill.
Well, that's a sad case of affairs, and it's a pity they didn't use the same sort of criteria for those sort of projects as they do when they consider regional projects to knock them on the head. As soon as
look, I can remember being in Townsville about 20 years ago, and the what's the name of that highway in the
Bruce or the
but you call it the Ross Highway or something, just into Townsville. Anyway, we got some heavy rain.
Rosstown Road, I think. It
was flooded. I could not believe it. Here is a major road into Townsville, and it's not above. It wasn't we're not talking about a cyclone. It was just an ordinary downpour, and it was flooded. How does that happen?
Our planning systems are pretty ordinary.
I think your politicians are even more ordinary.
Oh, there you go. Well, we might move on to the topic of the night, and that's this transition energy, or what's called a climate change.
Climate Transition Act.
Yeah, so I'll just get a screen share up of that. Right, it's an act to provide the reduction targets for greenhouse gases emissions and fossil fuel exports for Queensland, and provide the development, implementation of the Queensland Climate Transition Strategic Plan and other measures to achieve the reduction targets, to establish Queensland's Climate Transition Authority for related purposes. Well, that's the mouthful for it. I sort of wonder, why didn't they just call it the energy transition rather than the climate change?
Well, climate change is the bogeyman that they're trying to scare us with. And look, my position on climate change is that CO2 is a greenhouse gas. There's no doubt about that. The physics says it is. But that's just the start of the argument. We've got 0.04% CO2 in the atmosphere. So we're not all about to suffocate because it's too much CO2 there. Most of the warming effect of CO2 occurs in the first 50 parts per million. So 0.04 is 400 parts per million. Once you get up to where we are, you've got to double it to effectively increase the temperature by 1 degree centigrade. So they don't just talk about climate, they talk about a climate emergency. There is no climate emergency. The temperature of the Earth during the Holocene period, which is the last 10,000 years, which is that period of time that's been warm enough to allow us to invent agriculture, to invent mineralogy, mining of minerals and turning it into various things like steel and copper and bronze, and it allowed the Industrial Revolution to start. We are at the cooler end of that period. So there's nothing to be feared by another 1 or even 2 degrees worth of temperature. What you need to be scared about is the next ice age. That'll be what is destructive for the human race. But having a warm period, that's, go to the coast if you're feeling a bit hot, buy an air conditioner. It's not an existential threat, but they keep trying to convince us that it is. So that's why that word climate is in there rather than energy.
Do you think it's also because it's a private member's bill from a Greens that was the sort of chosen language?
Look, I'm surprised they didn't say the climate crisis bill. Climate transition, that sort of sounds a bit anodyne. I mean, I'm not sure how they think you transition a climate. Like, I've been around now for quite a while. My dad, as I said earlier, was born in 1912 and used to be pretty close to him. And he was a man who was out in the weather because he was a marine engineer. So he knew all about climate and hurricanes, or what we call cyclones, and floods, and all that sort of stuff. And he talked about the 1893 flood, which is worse than anything we've ever had in Brisbane since. He'd talk about how when John Oxley came up the Brisbane River at Breakfast Creek, there was a tree there with flood wreckage metres up the tree, much higher than the 1893 flood. Dad had talked about the cyclones that came through in the 50s and the 60s, and I experienced some in the 70s. We're actually in a pretty benign period now, but you'd have to be crazy to think that the climate that we've got now is much different from the climate we've had in the past, or that it could transition to a climate that's different in the future. What are they talking about? Is there some sort of Garden of Eden out there that they're trying to sell tickets to?
Well, I think that they keep pointing out that its temperature's risen by 1.5 degrees since the pre-industrialisation. But it's quite interesting when they put it to that period. Well, the Thames River didn't stop freezing over until 1813. That was the last ice there. So the globe came out of a what they call the Little Ice Age that was around for about 400 years roughly, and was pretty devastating. I think if you go back and read some of the history, well, that's when the plagues were around. There was a lot of floods, there was a lot of crop failures and that. And then the coming out of that period actually just happened to coincide with the start 1750, when the Industrial Revolution started, with the invention of the steam engine and that. So it's just a coincidence or just correlation that that's the starting point where they measure. So you would have think, being in the depths of the Little Ice Age, and you're coming out of it, would warm anyway. So, you know, to try to hype up this as beyond natural variation is somewhat a bit misleading, I think.
Well, look, it could be beyond natural variation, but it's very difficult with climate because there's just so many variables to attribute things to anything. And I was just doing some reading in the last few days, and there's been a new paper that's come out that suggests that about half the temperature increase that we've had is an artifact of what they call the urban heat island. So it's a well-known fact that cities are a couple of degrees at least warmer than the land around them. If you look at the thermometers and the long-term record from rural areas versus the record from urban areas, there appears to be, and this was a paper with, I think, 28 authors, so quite a significant paper. There appears to be at least a half a degree of and it's not quite 1.5 degrees yet, but about half of that is probably attributable to the fact that most of the thermometers doing the measurement are close to cars, which have a internal combustion engine, which means a fire under the hood. Tarmac, roadways, which being black, absorbs the solar radiation and heats the area around it up, which tend to chop trees down in urban areas. Trees tend to cool, both because they shade, but they also give off moisture, and that also has a cooling effect. So, there's a lot of nonsense being talked. Greeny's arguing with you that you're cherry picking. Well, picking the date that you're pointing to is a definite cherry pick. We had they call it the medieval climate optimum, somewhere around the time of the Great Crusades, actually, somewhere between 800 and 1200 AD. And we also have the Roman optimum, or Roman warm period, which was around about 0 AD. Now, CO2 can't be implicated in increasing the temperature between those high temperature periods and the cool temperatures that went before them. So what the Greenies have tried to do is to eliminate those altogether. And you're probably familiar with Michael Mann and his hockey stick. In fact, Michael Mann's got a new book out, which I've got on my desk to review. And I'll be interested to read it because tricky isn't the word I'd use to describe Michael Mann. He did some, what I think are very unethical things in terms of that hockey stick. It wasn't just the samples that he used. It wasn't just the algorithms that he used. It was that he took two different data sets and spliced them together at the point where one data set wasn't giving him the answer that he wanted, and he didn't bother to tell anyone that.
I think the other thing is too, with a lot of the weather stations, they're also historically been at airports and things like that. Well, you get records at airports all of a sudden, like Heathrow, I think last year or something, and it just happened to coincide with the taking off of about 3 Typhoon jets. So it seems that there's not a lot of quality control in a lot of this climate measuring sort of stuff. That's the problem.
No, there isn't. They actually, a lot of the long-term ones are at post offices. So another bit of my family history is that on the my children's mother's side, Sir Charles Todd, who brought the overland telegraph to from Darwin to Adelaide, was great-great-grandfather, I think. He was also the first Postmaster General, and he was a meteorologist. So he ensured that all the post offices were measuring temperature and taking water levels. So because you needed to do that to do the weather forecasting. Airports were another sort of obvious place to put them. And in the early days, airports were taking the sort of biplanes. Tinkler and people like that were arriving. So there wasn't an issue. And another place that they put these thermometers was at lighthouses, because, lighthouse keepers there was not a lot to do. And I actually pulled down the records from a number of our lighthouses, and they're isolated from any heat island effect. They're also close to the ocean, and one of the things that a lot of people don't understand is that 70% of the surface of the Earth is covered by water, and not only that, but it's the oceans that drive climate. So the air temperature is actually on average slightly cooler than the ocean, because there's a net transfer of heat from the ocean into the atmosphere. So these are ideally placed, and a number of them have very long records. And when you look at most of them, you cannot actually see a significant increase in temperature. And I think that's interesting. The Bureau tries to explain it away on the basis of, well, he didn't have Stephenson screens before 1911, but that's not correct in a lot of cases. And now, if you read people like Jennifer Marahasi, they've changed the measuring equipment from alcohol and mercury thermometers to electronic probes. And that probably has introduced a bit of a spurious increase and decrease in temperature. But again, you can't actually see it in the records from these stations, which are remarkably stable.
I think one of the other things that happened with the Met Bureau, they seem to have lost a lot of the paper records, so people can go back and check the raw data rather than the homogenised and adjusted.
Well, no, you can actually go back and check them, but the problem is getting the resources and getting the access. And I mentioned Jennifer Marahasi before. She's actually, or her husband, has run a number of freedom of information actions, and they've had some success in getting paper records coughed up, but they then have to spend a heck of a lot of time transferring those paper records into something electronic that you can then analyse. And they're only getting access to a fraction of them, but they're in the National Archives. So they are potentially accessible. You just need a government or a bureau who's interested in knowing
finding out the truth. Okay, we'll just go on a little bit further with that act that's coming up. I'll just share the screen again. We've got the main purpose for the Act are to state targets for Queensland to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and exports of fossil fuels that contribute to meeting Australia's obligation under the Paris Agreement. And it's got, note, the Paris Agreement targets that contribute to global goals of holding the increase in global average temperature well below 2 degrees C, above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. So that's their goal. But for the people who have got a little bit of worry about it, there's an item in there, item 10, fossil fuel export reduction targets. The fossil fuel export reduction target is the amount of coal or gas or oil extracted to produce from Queensland for export is reduced until no coal, gas or oil is extracted or produced from Queensland for export by 31st of December 2030. Now, that to people who are currently getting a lot of money from coal royalties into the Queensland coffers, and coal during the last 12 months or so is brought in somewhere about $400 billion worth of export value. It's a big item to sort of crunch down to zero.
It is. And that's one reason why the state government's not going to buy it, because their budget's being propped up. Now, the Greens would say that this is akin to a drug dealer saying, well, you shouldn't make drugs illegal because I'll lose my income. Their argument is, well, your income is based on making people sick. Now, I just reject that as a nonsense. Life expectancy has gone up around the world, even as we've been burning fossil fuels. So it's possible that fossil fuels do some damage to your health, but overall, they do more benefit than health. So that's the Greens' moral argument. There's some moral arguments against it as well, and that is that if we stopped our coal exports, that would actually put the price of coal and energy up worldwide. And there would be people in third world countries that would die as a result of that. Probably be people in first world countries who died as a result of that. It also wouldn't have any effect on overall emissions because there's no shortage of coal in the world. So you put the price of coal up and a whole lot of Indonesians, people in India, people in China, people in a whole range of other countries that aren't such big consumers of coal would suddenly find it profitable to mine their own coal because coal is still the cheapest form of generating electricity, no matter what the Greens tell you, in the world. So we'd be cutting off our nose to spite our face. We'd also have to pay compensation to those mining companies because, you know, a lot of them have got leases which go well beyond the next 7 years. They'd want to because the investment involved in setting up a mine is huge and you need decades, ideally, of returns to pay that back and make it worth your while. It would also create a huge amount of unemployment. So, you know, we did a study into it a couple of years ago and we thought statewide unemployment would go as high as 12.4%. And unemployment in some areas like the federal seats of Flynn and Dawson, that's Rockhampton, Mackay and Bowen, could be up to 42%. The budget would lose, where are we? Budget deficit would be 6 times larger, cumulative deficits of 10.8 billion and cumulative fiscal deficits of 29 billion. And that's not taking into account the extra royalties that Cameron Dick, this was done before Cameron Dick put those super taxes on. There'd be a decrease in direct and indirect gross tax product of 9% direct to 20% indirect. Workers would lose 1.7 billion per annum. Payroll tax would go down 630 million. You'd need to write off 193 billion worth of capital stock. A permanent reduction in gross state product of 7.3% or 27 billion. And loss of most of the income from the government-owned power utilities because most of them work on coal of around 500 million in 22-23. Well, I think the reality is they're sort of theoretical figures assuming that everyone stays in Queensland. I think if you stop coal exports and extracting coal, which means you wouldn't have a reliable power system, most people would have to leave Queensland. So you populate the place.
But there won't be any reliable power anywhere. But the thing is, what would also happen is suddenly you haven't got the money to run schools, you haven't got the money for ambulances, you haven't got the money for hospitals. all that comes into play. So your livability and your life expectancy in what is now a first world country could suddenly decline if you can't provide those services.
Yeah, there's a direct line relationship between electricity consumption and civilization. And, despite the best efforts of the decarbonistas, we burn barely less coal now in the world than we did when they started. So there's a straight line relationship between coal consumption and civilization as well. You're absolutely right.
The other thing is too, the Albanese, all governments, federal governments, they seem to be on this great big Ponzi scheme of mass migration, but it's going to be ramped up again. So you're looking at this situation where you're going to have a greater demand for electricity as time goes by. Some of the people who put this bill in with the Greens, their message is also, well, it's the new economy, so renewables will create new jobs and there will be new industries. I think that might be pushing the envelope a little bit far in regards to getting anywhere near the jobs that coal and fossil fuel electricity produce. So do you see any of this in their tail of reducing the use of fossil fuels and a replacement item in renewables actually occurring?
Well, look, let's just take the new economy to start with. It's not a new economy, even in their imaginings. It's the old economy, just with a different engine under it to produce power. And their problem is that you can't actually run an economy on the power sources that they're proposing. So that's your first problem. The second problem is all jobs aren't equal, Bill. We all want high-paying jobs. And the sorts of jobs that are available in the renewable industries area, after you've constructed the facilities themselves, are not as high paying as the jobs are in the power facilities that we have today. And they wouldn't be certainly as high paying if we replaced coal with nuclear, which would be a sensible option. So, yeah, they talk about job creation, but they're low paying jobs. They're not high paying jobs. They're not high skilled jobs. It's cutting the grass around solar panels or keeping them clean, that sort of thing. It's not the highly technical stuff that's happening in power stations.
The other thing is, it's also a risk to not only our energy security, but our national security, because our coal reserves are a strategic asset, whereas solar panels, the millions or billions that will have to come in, and the thousands of wind turbines, well, they're not manufactured here. We've got no input to their manufacture or production, maybe except for sending coal over to China so they can build them. But we also seem to be introducing a sovereign risk to the nation when we're depending on a supply chain. If we go to the situation where we close our coal-fired stations, and then we've got to keep bringing in more turbines and more solar panels, but we also have to replace the whole lot of them every 20 years. So we're completely dependent on overseas for the supply chain of these critical items for the new economy.
Yeah, that's right. Our big geostrategic competitor is China. They're also the ones that produce not just the solar panels and the wind turbines, but some of the really essential elements in them, which things like magnets, which need rare earths to make them long-lasting and cost-effective. Some of the rare earths are mined here, but they're processed into their final form in China. Another aspect of it is the sophisticated chips, computer chips, and they're made in Taiwan. And guess what country China is making noises about amalgamating into their own country? It's their sort of, Taiwan is where the losers in the Revolutionary War retreated to, and China sees it as unfinished business. And it's now 70 years since the anniversary of the Chinese Revolution. So it's a 70-year project. They're long-term thinkers, but we're terribly vulnerable, because if that happens, you can't go to war with China and then halfway through say, hey, we've run out of these essential components, could you sell us some? Not going to happen.
In regards to this act, the Australian Institute of Progress put in a submission. Basically, what was the basis of your submission? And also, how many other submissions were put in? And did anyone like the coal industry bother to make submissions?
Look, I'm not sure how many submissions went in, and I'm not sure whether the coal industry made a submission. We were invited to go in and personally present to the committee. The other presenters were, well, originally the Farmers Federation was going to be there, but for some reason they weren't. We were followed by 3 conservation organisations, the Environmental Defenders Office, the Conservation Foundation, I forget the other one, and then there was the Local Government Association of Queensland and what were they? The Central Region, I think, Local Government Council. So we were the ones that they had in to talk to them. So it sounds to me like, no, the coal industry didn't put a submission in. Sorry, what was the rest of your question, Bill?
Well, what formulated the basis of your...
what was the basis of our submission? Well, it proceeded along a number of lines. One was, it's not possible to do this and keep the Queensland economy running. Even if you did do it, it wouldn't have an effect on emissions, but it would have an effect on lives and livelihoods, and people would experience, some people would die as a result of it, and other people would experience lessened quality of life. That it underestimates the task. What people don't realise is that not only will we be adding to our electricity demand with electric cars, and that the so-called hydrogen economy also depends on electricity, but there's a whole lot of other things that depend on fossil fuels, which have nothing to do with electricity generation. And I'm talking about production of plastics. I'm talking about production of fertilisers. I'm talking about explosives. There are some manufacturing processes that really can't work with just electricity, and glass manufacture has a number of those. The actual task of decarbonising, if you take into account all the things that produce carbon dioxide, is 2.5 to 3 times what's involved in getting rid of coal-fired or fossil fuel electricity. Another point we made was that the more renewables electricity you put in, so-called renewables, because as you pointed out, you have to keep replacing the capital infrastructure, the more you need storage. We won't have viable storage in place until about 2035, but the Greens want us to be basically 100% renewables powered by 2030. And by viable storage, I'm talking about pumped hydro. The cost of batteries is just horrendous, and they're not making enough batteries to meet the demand at the moment, and that demand's going to increase. Pumped hydro does scale up, but you've got to find places for dams, and that takes time. And then you've got to build them. And to give you an example of how difficult that can be is Snowy Hydro was originally supposed to cost $2 billion and was supposed to be working 2 years ago. They're now talking about it being $12 billion and possibly online by 2030. So that was another element that we talked about, because if you can't have that storage, then you need some gas-fired power as backup. Coal-fired power stations can't be turned on and off with a switch, but there are some forms of gas-fired power that you can turn on pretty quickly. And if you look at AEMO, which is the Australian Energy Markets Operator, whose job is to plan the grid going out to the foreseeable future, 2050 at the moment. At 2050, even though the federal government is going for net zero, there is still a substantial proportion of gas-fueled power generation in there because they need it. Because you get these 1 in 100-year events that it's too expensive to buy the storage and have it just sitting around in case. So even the federal government's targets, unrealistic as they are, have a significant proportion of gas-fired power being available, not necessarily being used, but being available in 2050. Under the Greens plan, we wouldn't have that capacity post-2030. So there was a large basis to it. Our final take-out message was, if you're really serious about taking carbon out of the electricity generation process, you've got to look at nuclear.
The storage issue, I mean, it's quite amazing that we had the government, I think about 2 years ago, create the hydro group for government group, and already assigned $12 billion to a pumped hydro in the Burdick and Pioneer area. And there's another one as well further south. And of course, you've got the small scale one at the old Kidston mine. But it seems to me it's amazing that we in the north and regional Australia in general and regional Queensland, we're always banging on about water security. I mean, Cairns hasn't got water security. We're sort of on a system now. We're going to pump water from the Mulgrave River, which they agree is only good for 15 years before it sort of expires and our population overtakes it. Townsville got to the situation a couple of years ago where it's down to 8% capacity in the Ross Dam. And any project where we want a dam built for irrigation or that seems to always run foul of some cost-benefit analysis from the government. Yet they could quickly find $12 billion to come up with a pumped hydro in central Queensland. And then they have the audacity to turn around and say, well, aren't we good looking after central Queensland? We've invested the equivalent to $9,000 per person in central Queensland with this project. Well, that project doesn't deliver anything. It doesn't deliver one drop of water for potable water for drinking. It doesn't, no drop of water for agriculture to improve productivity. It's simply there to attract votes in southeast Queensland. So it's sort of, it's starting to rile a lot of people up in regional Queensland, this flood of wind turbine, wind farms and solar farms that seem to be thrown onto us and our farmers, courtesy of the southeast Queensland government and electorates.
Yeah, no, I can understand your frustration. I was following the Urana Dam for quite a while, and I gather the state's sort of taken it out. It was originally to be a irrigation agricultural project up there behind Bowen, as well as having some pumped hydro. I gather now it's just going to be pumped hydro. I was interested in Sir Leo Hilsch's revamping of the plan to push waters back west. You know, you've got the dam there near Charters Towers, and you could look at making that high enough that what Leo was suggesting might be possible in the future, but that's not going to happen either, even though Bob Catter, I'm sure, is doing his best
Unless it's got climate change in the feature of whatever's being proposed, it's not going to get a Guernsey. It has to be something to do with climate change, and then you've probably got a chance of getting a project. But the thing is, pumped hydro is still an inefficient sort of system. You've still got to have a reservoir, an full and an empty reservoir somewhere, and you either let the water go down to the bottom reservoir and then pump it back. And so you only got to get about 50% of the energy that it takes to push it up to when it comes down. The other thing is that this is going to be produced by this energy that's going to push the water back up the hill is going to be created by spare energy from wind turbines. But the thing is, does anyone or has anyone done a calculation of exactly how much or how big a wind farms we have to actually just generate the 12? I think we have about 12 gigawatts of baseload power in Queensland. I don't think anyone's got a grip on exactly how much wind and solar installations we have to build to actually do this, even if we do have pumped hydro to back it up.
I think you're basically right. They have models, but I don't think the models are accurately modelling what is happening. The problem with wind and to a lesser extent solar is that you can't be sure how much you're going to get of it. With solar, you know that when it's nighttime, you're getting zero, but you don't know what cloud cover is going to be, etc. With wind, you just don't know when the wind's going to be blowing. You'll have some idea as to how much you need just to devote to the storage, but you won't know in absolute terms because the storage might be needed for, so the two major dams the state government's talking about will discharge electricity for 24 hours and then they'll need to be refilled. So what if you have a need because there's a cyclone coming down the coast and the wind's too strong for your turbines to operate, and the skies are too cloudy and there's too much rain for you to produce much in the way of solar energy? What are you going to do then? And once you've discharged them, it takes you another day to recharge them. So the chances are that you might only be able to safely use them for 6 hours because you might not have 24 hours after you've discharged them to build it back up. So these are actually very complicated questions. And it's one of the reasons why renewable energy sounds like it's cheap, but ends up being very expensive because you need multiple redundancies to make it work. And the whole theory that it's cheap is based on the fact that you don't have to pay for wind and you don't have to pay for sun. Well, it might surprise some of your listeners, Bill, but a lot of the power stations don't have to pay for coal. If you go down to Victoria in the Yallourn Valley, the Latrobe Valley, Yallourn and the Latrobe Valley, they own the field of coal next to them, and their cost of coal is the cost of extraction, which is digging it up and sticking it on a conveyor belt, and it's pulled into the generator. There's no difference between that and having a wind turbine. Ultimately, the coal-fired power generator needs to be replaced. Ultimately, the turbine will need to be replaced. And the suggestions are they might not have the 20-year life that are being promised by the manufacturers, because, of course, they're making that promise without ever having seen any of their products up for 20 years. So that's one reason we come back to nuclear. Nuclear might be a bit more expensive than coal, and I say might be because that's not a definite. But if people are so fixated on doing away with CO2 emissions in their power generation, then the only thing that makes sense is nuclear, because you can basically put it in next to your disused coal-fired power station, and it uses exactly the same networks. It doesn't require any of this backup.
And also thousands of kilometres of extra transmission lines that seems to be annoying a lot of people in regional Australia.
Yeah, and those transmission lines, they're also going to suffer for not being used very often, because you're going to need to have power standing by for those times when everything else fails. So, you know, productivity, we were talking about that earlier. Another term for that when it comes to assets is capital utilisation. So the better the capital utilisation, if you think of a hotel, so you've got your capital there, if it's full 100% of the time, you'll make a good return. If it's full 20% of the time, you'll be heavily underwater because you've got these high fixed costs that go with it. It's more or less the same thing with electricity networks, except for one thing, that whereas with the hotel, you only have to pay for what you use, we have a network regulator that makes all of us pay, even when we're not using the network. So that means the lower your capital utilisation on these interconnectors, the higher your electricity bill will go.
Yeah, well, the current state government's pretty smart. It's taken the extra coal royalties from the coal companies and started to shell it out with $500 gifts to households to sort of cover the fact that their electricity bills are skyrocketing.
They have, yes, but that's only to some people. And the costs will be apparent to other people and also to businesses. You know, something like 11% of our power goes into refining aluminium. And the price for those people can't be held down indefinitely. And Rio Tinto, who owned, CRA rather, used to be Rio Tinto, who owned one of those refineries, they actually wrote the value of it off in their accounts the other day. When you write the value off, that means you don't think it's got a future economic life. That's where we're heading. No matter how many $500 checks they hand out, there'll be a lot of people needing a lot more than $500 if one of those smelters closes down. Just imagine what that'll do to the city of Gladstone.
One of the other things they keep touting is what's going to run parallel with renewables in the new economy is hydrogen. But it seems a strange sort of thing that you'd want to get involved in a system where you've got inefficient generators providing electricity for something you're only going to get, if you're going to create hydrogen, you're going to have to put in more energy than you get out just on the initial part of it by the electrolyzer. And then if you actually want to actually get that to somewhere else, you've got to go through the trauma of another lot of energy to compress it, cool it down to freezing and put it into high pressure containers and ship it off somewhere. So all along that step, you're just building in inefficiency. Does anyone sort of look at that in regards to, well, that's not a very good business model?
Well, some people do, and they don't invest in it. Some people don't, like Twiggy Forrest, and you see suddenly got very high executive turnover. And my supposition is that Twiggy's executives are looking at this hydrogen economy fantasy and saying, this isn't going to work. If the boss is going to push ahead with this, I'm going to find something that will work and will pay me. The amount of electricity you get out of hydrogen is something like a fifth of the amount you have to put in to make it in the first place. Hydrogen is like pumped hydro, essentially a battery. The problem with batteries is that they're very hard to use for large transport. They're not going to work for shipping. they're not going to work for aircraft. So the idea is that hydrogen might fill that gap. So instead of putting batteries in, you'll put effectively a chemical which you can combust or use in a fuel cell, being hydrogen, which will act like a battery. But, you know, when my computer that I'm talking to you on, and it's running on batteries at the moment, when it goes back on the mains to recharge, it's not going to take 5 times as much electricity as it's then going to put out to make it work. So that part of the economics is all wrong. Then they're talking about shipping it overseas. They want to become a renewable energy superpower, a hydrogen superpower. And they're talking about shipping it to places like Japan. Japan's starting to build its own, a new fleet of nuclear reactors. Why would the Japanese pay us to produce this inefficiently here and then ship it all the way over there when they can probably do it more cheaply themselves, although not more sensibly, using nuclear power and not have to shift it anywhere? You know, it doesn't make any sense.
Well, the thing is, we seem to have a problem with renewables actually making sense in any way or form going ahead as a cost-effective means of producing our baseload power. But we've still got 2 issues that we need to deal with. Is we've got plenty of coal. We we've had this drama where people telling us that, well, more CO2 is going to boil the world, yet there's no proof. There's no real proof of that.
Did you say boil the world?
Yeah, well, that's the new term, isn't it?
So someone's saying it's going to get to 100 degrees centigrade.
Well, that's where our man from the UN. We've gone from global warming to global boiling, and that was only in the
problem
last.
is there's not enough STEM graduates, or if there are, they're not filling the positions that count, because even a high school student doing chemistry would tell you that's nonsense.
Well, that's right, but that's the language.
Maybe he's been reading Lewis Carroll, you know, the Walrus and the Carpenter. Why the sea is boiling hot and whether pigs have wings.
But that's the sort of language the UN people get away with, and even our media doesn't pull them up on it, and that's the worst part. But I would also suspect that most people wouldn't even know what the hypothesis of catastrophic anthropogenic global warming was. I mean, like you, I came into this debate back in the 90s, sort of thing, and the hypothesis tended by, I think it was Mr. Hansen at the time, and has his group, and that was that if you double CO2, you'll get 1 degree of warming. That's the general proven physics. But what they said is it would be amplified by the increase in water vapor threefold. So that's been the hypothesis, and that's never been. There's no evidence for that at all. But that's what seems to rule the conversation. Do we sort of give up the fight to sort of, well, say, let's keep using coal because global warming isn't really doing the damage that people say, or CO2 emissions are not doing the damage say, or do we just give up on that and try to push the message, well, let's go straight to nuclear?
Look, I don't think that we should be completely relaxed about putting CO2 into the atmosphere. I think there's some limit to that. I think we're a long way away from that. But I wouldn't want to think that in 10 generations' time we were pushing up against that limit. So, yeah, I think nuclear is a sensible and a good option. And that there's new, I was going to say technologies, I guess they are technologies. The old nuclear power reactors that might be 1 or 2 gigawatts and really loom large on the horizon and need a lot of water, they're being challenged and put to one side by Generation 4 reactors, things like small modular reactors that can be as small as 50, 70 megawatts or 300 megawatts. To put that in perspective, the nuclear generators that power nuclear submarines and some of the surface fleet of the United States Army are about 70 megawatts. So it's a new technology for civilian purposes, but it's an old technology for military purposes. They don't need water, in fact, not in the same amounts. In fact, the Bill Gates version uses molten salt as its coolant, not water at all. So I think, they're game changers. And when you're talking 70 megawatts, you can actually locate it in a community. You don't need to run a network there to make it work. But I think one of the other solutions is that the population of the world is going to decrease. We're going to top out at somewhere between 8 and 10 billion, I think. But as we get richer, we have fewer children. And one of the dirty secrets of climate change, from an Australian's point of view, is that we absorb as a continent more CO2 than we put into the atmosphere. So Australia's actually solved the climate change problem, if there is indeed a problem there, because we've got a few enough people on a large enough landmass that it's not a problem. And I think that's probably where the world will end up, that there will be uses that you can't decarbonise sensibly, but it won't matter. The globe itself will absorb it. CO2 is a plant food. We've had something like a 20-30% increase in plant productivity since the big increase in CO2. Every time you eat an oyster at your favourite seafood restaurant, Bill, the shell that it comes into is a huge amount of sequestration.
About 40% is CO2.
CO2, just absolutely massive. So the Earth is actually pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere all the time. And one of the problems that we were potentially facing was too little CO2, not enough. I don't think we're in the CO2 sweet spot at the moment. I think we could do with a lot more CO2. It would be good for plants. It would be good for a lot of other things. A little bit of extra temperature would actually be good, because extra cold is what we've got to worry about. So I think long term, it'll solve itself. Short term, I don't have a problem with decarbonising some sections of the economy if you can do it. But I wouldn't be losing too much sleep over it.
Well, I think the general proposition should be well, we're not in a position where we have to do something dramatic as yet, and we've got time to go through and keep using fossil fuels for a reasonable amount of time, and then at the same time look forward to a smooth transition to nuclear sometime in the future. And we could avoid all this upheaval that we're having with renewables in regards to the cost that they're making us incur, the land usage that they're taking up, and basically the disruption to a lot of the environment unnecessarily. Because like you say, if we transition at an orderly pace from coal in the future, we don't need any more area of land. We can just do the same thing on what is coal sites and use the current transmission system.
Yeah, look, we're trying to do the impossible. We're trying to move from one technology to another within a space of decades. If you think about the motor car, then I'll sort of go back to my dad. They invented the motor car at the end of the 19th century. Dad was born in 1912. He used to tell me about the people, and I grew up in the house that he was born in. So, we had, I don't know, but it was 106 years that had been in the family by the time we sold it. When I was growing up, we maybe had 50 or 60 years worth of experience in that area. He'd point at the house up the road and say they used to have a buggy and 2 horses. They were the rich people in the area. People didn't have cars. The sort of single car family didn't happen until, for richer people, in the 20s, 30s. The 2-car family didn't happen until the 60s, 70s. And cars being as cheap and plentiful as they are now, maybe only the last 20 years. So you basically had 100 years for that technology to reach maturity. And here we are saying, well, in Queensland, we're still getting most of our power from coal-fired power stations, but within 7 years, they're all going to be gone. It's just impossible on any historical precedent. It's just a nonsense.
Just on the other thing there, when we transferred from or upgraded from the horse and buggy to the car, the taxpayer didn't pay for petrol stations either, but it seems to be everyone wants the taxpayer to pay for recharging stations.
No. Well, again, Dad told the story that his mother bought a car when he was 16, so that was 1928. And she couldn't drive, so he had to actually drive illegally for a year or two till he was eligible for a driver's permit, a learner's permit. But, they didn't get a government subsidy for that. They decided they needed a car and they saved up, however, and bought it. The whole petroleum industry grew without government subsidies and still does today, even though the Greenies all pretend that it gets government subsidies. It doesn't. It's a net contributor to the bottom line of government coffers and obviously to our standard of living. So, no, this whole idea that you've got to be bribed to do something, if you've got to be bribed to do it, it's generally not a good idea.
No, that talks about inefficiencies. Look, we've gone well over the hour. We might wrap it up here. But if you'd just like to finish off on any activities or that the Australian Institute of Progress is involved in, or will we seeing it published any time?
Well, we've got a few. We're doing a bit of work on health at the moment. We've got a few dinners and lectures coming up. In fact, today week, we've got a lecture that we do annually called the McElwraith Lecture, which is to honour entrepreneurialism and contributions to Queensland. It's a centenary of Mount Isa being founded as a mine. And so we've made the men, mostly, who made Mount Isa the success that it eventually was, the subject. And we've got Robert Gottliebson, who's a financial journalist of some note, writes daily for the Australian these days, even though he's in his 80s. So he's going to deliver the lecture on behalf of the people, many of whom obviously can't be with us because they can't be with anyone anymore. In October, we've got a talk by retired General Peter Layton on defence. Defence is something that we're pretty interested in. We're also doing work on housing. Housing affordability is one of those issues that has crept up on the policymakers, although it shouldn't. It's been obvious that there's an issue there for probably 10 years at least, and more than that. And I think there's some solutions. And you alluded to the migration that's coming into Australia earlier on in the interview, and that's just putting the squeeze on, not just for people wanting to buy a house, but people wanting to rent a house. We're going from a place of plenty to a place of plenty of famine. So, yeah, we're doing a few things. And also the end of October, beginning of November, I'll be in London at a conference, the ARC conference. So it's the Association for Responsible Citizenship. It's an idea originally of Jordan Peterson's, but John Howard and Tony Abbott and Amanda Stoker and John Anderson, a number of people from Australia are involved in setting that up, and it sees itself as a counterweight to the World Economic Forum, which is the source of a lot of the bad ideas that we've been talking about this evening.
Right, we've got a good rundown there, and just touching on the price of housing, it doesn't help when the government keeps coming up with improving the national standard of building that drives up the cost of housing by 20 or 30,000, because now every house has to be completely fit out for disabled. They're all new houses, and it's like there's a capital investment, but it may never see any return, because there's a good possibility there's a good percentage of new houses will never have a disabled person in them.
Yeah, it's just over, I looked this up the other day, quite conscious of it. It's just over 1% of the population has a wheelchair. So we're going to make 100% of the housing stock suitable for wheelchair occupants, even though, as you say, most of them will never see a person in a wheelchair in them. I've never had a person in a wheelchair over to my house. I know people that have wheelchairs, but they've never been over here. There are alternative arrangements if that's the issue, if you want to visit with them. And you can always retrofit your house if you need to. And if the government wants to pay for that even, that might make some sense, but it doesn't make any sense to make new home buyers of every new home in the country pay for it. That's just utterly ridiculous.
It's also like the going up to 7-star energy rating of that. Well, guess what? In Cairns and probably tropical Queensland, where we tend to have the doors open as much as possible, we don't need double glazing on our windows. Making a house have double glazing in some areas is pointless. I mean, I understand maybe down in Tasmania, but this just open blanket that every house has got to be suddenly 7-star, regardless of where it's located, is somewhat ridiculous.
Yeah, we just used to put an extra sweater on when it got a bit cold.
Okay, look, Graham, thanks very much for your time tonight. If you just stay on the line there, I'll just wrap the show up and introduce next week's show. Thanks very much for your time, Graham.
You're welcome. Thank you.
If you enjoyed tonight's program, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Next week, join me for a show with Matt Cornish, and we'll be talking all things crocodile in northern Queensland. Just recently, we've had a number of issues with illegal killing of crocodiles in north and central Queensland, but we've also had a big killing spree, it seems, on the Norman River, where up to 14 crocodiles have been shot illegally. So we'll be talking to Matt Cornish on his views of human and crocodile interaction and what we need to do. So join me then. Thank you.